Alright, so our presentation is about should a patient's tissues be used for research?
Okay, so we're going to start with our background and history. So, there are plenty of diseases known in the world today that have yet to determine their cause or how they exist in our bodies. And the majority of these diseases obviously affect a lot of people and their loved ones. In today's day and age, there's a lot of technology. So a lot of people ask, like, how hasn't anyone, found a cure? Like, why can't we get through this with all this research? But we're learning that there may be a better way, or not better way, to study these silent killers up close. Make no mistake about it, there is plenty of technology out there, but it is possible that we're just not at the right point yet. For example, one of the better ways in which we're going to be talking about is possibly like a brain tumor. So a patient that has a brain tumor removed, could maybe actually looking at the tumor itself up close be what we need to actually get through this and find out what causes these tumors to even form. And these researchers have begun to argue that human tissue research is almost getting to be the best way to even do the research in the first place. The most common form of tissue research is like organ donors. So when you get your driver's license, you can register to be an organ donor. But after thinking about this, scientists have realized that looking at the actual removed tissue may or may not be a better way to find these cures. When this type of clinical study came into play, it took the world and science of medicine to a whole new level, but also really made it controversial at the same time, and this is why it's our topic, because it's a super controversial issue in biology right now. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and like where it all started. So the history of human tissue research dates back to the earliest at the Greeks and the Romans. So we have this picture right here. And that's how they used to study anatomy. And then the Roman Empire fell, and they banned anatomical studies. So people quit studying anatomy and physiology. And then in the 15th century, it was reintroduced, and people didn't have to worry about the threatening of execution. So they started studying it again. And it just over time developed as people learned to the way and functions of the human body. And actually, so the research with human tissue cells actually is kind of recently new though. They knew it existed back then, but not as much as we do now. A researcher, Laura Lane from BIO140N, she talks about this in an article. She said, in 1951, a researcher at Johns Hopkins University created the first human cell line from sample of an unwitting cancer patient, and they were called HeLa cells, which Olivia will talk about here shortly. But they went on to serve crucial roles in the development of the polio vaccine and in the study of many silent diseases that people just die from and don't even know why. And this subject of research became one of the most controversial known to man, like I said, and there are many factors that make this topic controversial, which we'll go into, including medical ethics, and to the point where the government has stepped in and set laws.
So for us to help you guys fully understand the controversial issues surrounding this research, it's really important for you guys to understand the laws, treaties, and regulations that the government has set forth. So the first thing that really helped other nations create all these laws and treaties was the Declaration of Helsinki, according to clinchem.com, which was founded by the World Medical Association. This was a set of ethical principles that focused on human experimentation and inspire the common rule, which are regulations within the Code of Federal Regulations. And this is considered one of the most widely recognized sources of guidance for medical studies. So the common rule, like I mentioned before, is mostly enforced by the Office of Human Research Protection, which is a division of the Department of the Health and Human Services. So if any institution or department wants to conduct research and human experimentation is being utilized, they must submit a federal-wise assurance document. So this states that the institution will comply with all regulations that the HHS has set forth. And the common rule, this is important to note, never applies to living individuals, and it never mentions tissue ownership. So an important aspect of the common rule is informed consent, which is the permission that a patient grants their doctor to perform any sort of research. This is required by the Institutional Review Board, which is responsible for overseeing all research that involves testing on human subjects. So the researcher needs to inform their participant of the purpose and duration of their experiment, and they need to be highly specific with their explanation. They also need to let the donor or participant, whatever their title may be, know that it is completely voluntary for them to leave and that there will absolutely be no penalty if they choose to do that. So, in order for us to understand a little more about tissue ownership, since it wasn't explicitly mentioned in the common rule, we're going to look at some different court cases that help us better understand this tissue ownership. So Moore versus the Regents of the University of California is a great example of this. So patient John Moore was going to the UCLA Medical Center for hairy cell leukemia. So his physician David Gold recommended that he have his spleen removed to research on this hairy cell leukemia. But unbeknownst to Moore, he actually created a cell line of his T lymphocytes from this spleen and actually created a $3 billion cell line like I just mentioned. So after John Moore found out about this, he instigated a lawsuit, but unfortunately the court ruled in the favor of David Gold because the court determined that after a cell or tumor has been extracted from the patient's body, they no longer own the rights to them. So this is displayed in multiple cases such as Greensburg versus Miami Children's Research Institute Incorporated and Washington University versus Catalona, which display very similar cases which basically state that once a patient's tumor or cell is removed from their body, they no longer own any rights or ownership to them whatsoever.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the advantages or pros to the side of using the human tissue. So there are plenty of them, but a couple that we're going to highlight is the improvement that it makes to scientific discovery, how it improves human health in society in general. So there, like I said in the beginning in the intro, there are a plethora of diseases that researchers, the smartest brains out there just still can't find cures to. But using this human tissue research could further the scientific discovery behind these diseases and help to make people more healthy at the same time. So we're going to talk about one of the most prime roles in this human furthering scientific discovery. So the first one is human fetal tissue. So human fetal tissue, is sometimes more valuable to scientists than adult tissue because when you're a fetus, you can see you're growing. So the stage of life is different, and that's why your tissue is a little bit more valuable to them. The fetal tissue allows the researcher to study how it is possible for that certain disease to grow and affect the individual system as they go from adolescent to adult. Fetal tissue is also one of the earliest impacts to the entire world of human tissue research, beginning in the late 1930s. And since that time, it has completely boomed and became one of the leading tools used to create prevention at the time. Using these fetal cells, it played an essential role into development for vaccines like polio, rubella, chickenpox. It also has taken the potential to take part in curing like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and strokes, neurodegenerative diseases. Hans Clevers, he's a medical writer, he writes in one of his articles, the development of vaccines against polio, rubella, measles, chickenpox, adenovirus, rabies, and treatments for debilitating diseases such as arthritis, fibrosis, and hemophilia all involve fetal tissue. He also continues to talk how it is being used to test and develop vaccines for treatment of the flu, dengue fever, HIV and AIDS, and hepatitis B and C. Clevers believes that not only have they made strides for vaccines, but like I said, they're working towards finding a cure for Alzheimer's or even what causes it in the first place. This research could be catastrophic in improving human health and scientific discovery. All these diseases, as mentioned, previously impact our world more than we even talk about. According to Alzheimer's.com, 1 in 3 seniors die from Alzheimer's, so that's a lot. These statistics are ultimately just staggering. The day that there's a cure for that kind of disease will be the day millions of lives are saved worldwide. And that is just one way or one example that human tissue research is pushing our world to limits that we didn't even know existed before. The other advantage I'd like to mention is with this picture right here. And these are cadavers. Now, I didn't use a real picture of a real cadaver because that kind of would have been gory. But these are what prospective medical students use. They use them in the lab every day. Nurses, physician assistants, surgeons, doctors, anything that you can think of. This is how they learn. And if people weren't, there's a lot of people that when they pass away, they donate their body to science. You know, they say, hey, you know, I'm okay with my cadaver being used to teach somebody, to save somebody else. And if you think about it, you know, what's a better way to learn than looking at it up close? You know, you could talk about the functions of the liver, but when you dive into the body and you're looking at it, it's a completely different ballgame. These cadavers can be used for students to either like practice procedures or kind of just to cut open and look around and learn the anatomy and the physiology. Like I said, there's no learning about the body until you've actually been in it. I mean, it's scary to think, being the first person that your surgeon ever operated on, I definitely would not want them to be my doctor. So this is super important for them, and if we didn't have these, our prospective medical professionals would not be able to do the job that they do every day. And then our writer, Hannah Nichols, she studied a group of medical students, and basically what happened in this study was they had a group of students they were studying the pulmonary system, and they had this group of students study the anatomy by using the cadaver, and then they had the other group of students studying the same exact system but learning off like a PowerPoint like so. And they both took the exact same exam, and the students that used the cadaver statistically had a higher average, scored better. So you can just see that essentially they're a necessity to these people's educations, and it's just validating how we really do need this kind of stuff. So not only is it just pushing scientific discovery to the max and improving human health by trying to fight these diseases, but it's also, we need somebody in the future to save lives, and that's what we get here. So for those reasons, in my opinion, human tissue needs to be conducted and treated and used as valuable research.
Okay. So although studying tissue continues to aid society immensely, there are many instances where it's negatively impacted individuals, especially the donors' families. So although informed consent is included within the Code of Federal Regulations, it doesn't always benefit the patient. As I said before, after a tissue has been extracted from a patient's body, they no longer own any rights to them. So because of this, many researchers have made millions of dollars off of cell lines or commercial tests obtained from these patients, but the families were left with no shares. A brilliant example of this is HeLa cells, which is like an amazing example of breeding researchers that is shown a lot in different classes. So these cells provide a whole new world of possibilities for the scientific world, but according to Kelsey Russo, who wrote the article, The Digital Life of Henrietta Lacks, while researchers were basking in the success of their cell findings, the family of Henrietta Lacks were still in poverty and couldn't even afford health insurance. Her name was virtually unknown to the rest of the world, and her husband even revoked permission from the researchers to not use her cells, but they ended up selling the vials for $25. So the fact that her cells lived beyond Lacks herself was heartbreaking for her family, and they continue to struggle with the prospect of being tricked by the doctors and the media. According to clinchem.com, which discussed human tissue and ownership, there are many court cases that describe a scenario similar to this. As I explained earlier, the case involving John Moore and the doctor David Gold experienced the same scenario where Dr. Gold ended up being the one who succeeded, even though he was the one that tricked John Moore, and even though all he wanted was to just have his hairy cell leukemia taken care of. So a lot of times the same scenario is played. The researcher manipulates the patient, makes millions of dollars off of cell lines and commercial tests, and the patient and their family ends up being left with almost nothing. So another example of something that's really negative for tissue research is invasion of privacy. So in the New York Times, they discussed a professor, Jeffrey Gray, who was a professor at Des Moines University, instructed students to unlock their cell phones and hand them to the person next to them. So we're not actually going to display this in class, but it's definitely something that not a lot of people would want to do. And he ended up explaining that this was very similar to tissue research. A lot of times, even though this research is being done for good things, a lot of times they're not getting permission from the actual donors or patients to use the cells in the first place. So also, something that's really helpful to understand that this research isn't always, the best for the community is the lack of research that some areas have they're not really benefiting the public. So, for example, circulating tumor cells, this study hasn't been fully developed yet, and it's taking decades to even be beneficial for us to use. So, circulating tumor cells occur at extremely low concentration in the peripheral blood, which are cells that are suspended in the blood plasma. And although progress has been made in developing microfluidic devices, they're still relatively new. So the researchers intend to enrich these cells by using protein. So by using this protein, they end up attaching the cells to columns, and it can help the devices detect these cells more easily. But although this is sort of displaying some progress, they still don't even understand the whole biology of these cells. So it's kind of concerning for the public to see that although this research is being taken over decades, it's really not providing any leverage or any closer of a cure to helping prevent cancers. So lastly, we just want to conclude by saying that even though that these cells are they have like a monumental impact to the medical field, they continue to be extremely helpful. They're problematic to know that the common rule doesn't discuss any tissue ownership of any kind. They allow the researchers and institutions to manipulate the patients for self-gain because they're not actually explicitly saying in the common rule any sort of mention of tissue ownership. So if this were changed, my stance would change, because if these families were financially compensated for the cells that they're donating to these researchers, I think this would definitely be a big change, and that they would actually listen to the patients when they're granting permission, denying it. It would definitely be a less corrupt system, but if it isn't, then it's not really beneficial if it's hurting people in the process.
And on my side, in conclusion, my opinion on the whole human tissue research is that I really think it should be one of the most highest used research methods in the medical field. It has proved to be one of the most effective ways to attempt to improve our human health for diseases that we can't find cures to. It's advanced scientific discovery beyond belief. Who would have thought 100 years ago that we were able to look at a brain tumor? And it's the way that medical students are taught by human tissue. It's the huge way to ensure solid medical professionals for our future, to care for our kids in the future. So I truly believe that it is essential in the future of the science and medicine and how we understand human anatomy and physiology.
Thank you very much.